Hi, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? This is a show where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events selected from recent administration actions, headlines, listener questions, or interesting legal issues that we identify ourselves. My name is Sadhana Devaraja, and I am not a constitutional scholar, but lucky for me, my friend Ken Thomas is. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Good, Sadhana. How are you?
I am doing well, thank you. And so today, actually, we're going to embark on that kind of last part of it, interesting legal issues that Ken has identified himself. And we're going to kind of walk through whether the Constitution can survive President Trump and kind of what we need to do to help it survive future presidencies like this. So to get us kicked off, maybe, Ken, you can start us off on what took you down this line of thinking.
So actually, I'd almost say that what's taken me down this line of thinking has been cocktail parties. And that has been the last month or so. Any place that I go where I'm talking to people about politics, there seems to be a genuine question as to whether or not the Constitution is, in fact, in any way a hindrance on the actions of President Trump. You might remember that President Trump recently posted a picture of himself with a crown on his head and with the phrase "Long live the King" underneath it. Put that on his own social media site. And other things that are kind of go along with that is that he has defied court orders. He has deported immigrants without due process. He has threatened free speech at universities. And when asked recently if it's his responsibility to uphold the Constitution, he said that he didn't know. And you would think that he would know. It's in the presidential oath that he has taken. As a matter of fact, he's taken it twice. And it's about the only thing that is in the presidential oath is him swearing on a Bible to uphold and protect the Constitution. So you would think that he would remember that. So the real issue that I think people are asking is, are we in a constitutional crisis? And I think scholars tend to draw a clear line. I'm not sure I agree with it, but the line is when a president defines a clear order of the Supreme Court, then this is a constitutional crisis. At this point, the president has mostly questioned lower court orders. There has certainly been at least one or two cases in the immigration cases where there's some contempt proceedings going on. These are probably mostly going to be focused on agency officials, but there may still be some cases where there will be contempt cases brought against members of the administration. And there's one case where the president and his agency officials are not responding with a lot of speed to a fairly vague sense that the Supreme Court suggested that there should be facilitation of the return of a person who has been deported. But besides that, there has not been what people would consider to be a clear break with the Supreme Court on a legal issue. And so we may not be in what would yet be described as constitutional crisis. I personally think that even if the president defies the Supreme Court, that's not the end of the game, because there are legal steps that the Supreme Court and all courts can bring against mostly agency officials to make the agency do what they need to, mostly the contempt power, which we discussed in a previous podcast. But certainly, as far as politics go, a defiance of the Supreme Court ranks very, very high on what I would call constitutional aggression. So what I think we are really seeing here from President Trump and his agency officials is a high level of constitutional aggression. It is not that unusual for agency officials, for presidents to challenge the prevailing legal precedents of a Supreme Court. It's usually done in very narrow cases. It's done slowly. It's done carefully. It's done with a certain amount of concern for respect for the court precedent, but it certainly has happened in other administrations. In this administration, everything is happening at once, and it's not being done in a slow, careful way. It's being done with just these very, very aggressive actions, closing agencies, impounding money, firing employees, ending independent agencies. These are clearly in violation of existing court precedent, and they are things that can and will be litigated. So in that sense, they are not outside of our constitutional context, but they are a level of constitutional aggression I don't think we've ever seen before.
Yeah. So if I can sum up what you're just saying, sounds like, to the answer of are we in a constitutional crisis? Not yet. And that scholars define it as when a president defies a clear order of the Supreme Court. I know I've been reading a lot of headlines over the last couple of months saying that we are in one, but there is some sort of definition to it that is agreed upon by scholars, and it's when the president's defying a clear order of the Supreme Court. And your take is that even if he does, that doesn't mean the end of democracy. There's still steps at that point that we can take that are within our legal system. And so maybe if we were going to triage this, there's an emergent situation and an urgent situation. We're kind of in the urgency where there's this really high level of constitutional aggression, and it's intended to be disruptive. And while that may be the case, it still fits within our constitutional framework. And so we are still within the realm of maybe I don't know if it was expected by the Constitution, but is manageable through those frameworks. Okay. And so what do you think is going to happen next? Do you think the Supreme Court is going to go along with the Trump administration? Do you think what do you think is going to happen next, and maybe what should happen next?
So this falls into the extremely unknowable area. Often when you're talking about the normal kind of low speed over a period of time challenge to Supreme Court precedents, you have some sense of where the various justices stand. In this case, so many of these challenges to precedent are so extreme and so aggressive and go so far outside of anything the Supreme Court has even hinted at before that it's hard to tell exactly what the court's going to do. And in some cases, I think, you might pick up a few justices, but you might not necessarily win. And I think that there's an interesting thing you have to keep in mind here. So most of what's being challenged by the Trump administration is the expansion of executive power. And when I say this is the idea that the executive is really unreined by mostly congressional control over how he exercises power. Now, that's an interesting thought because if you think about it, Congress is the one that gives him the power in the first place. They give them the power to have an agency, to run an agency, to hire people, to regulate it in this area, but not in this area. And so it seems a little unusual, the thought that the president, once he gets an agency, can essentially say, gee, thanks, Congress, and then do anything he wants with it. It seems kind of counterinstinctual, not an obvious thing for the Supreme Court to sign off on completely. And what we're really all talking about is something, again, we talked in a previous podcast, is whether the term in Article 2 that says executive power is vested in the president, whether that means something completely unlimited, or whether that is something that is limited by Congress. And I think that is something that the Supreme Court certainly has been signaling that perhaps Congress doesn't have as much power in this area, certainly as we've been talked about previously, whether or not Congress can create independent agencies where a president can't fire people. That's one line of reasoning. But in terms of this much broader idea that the president can just eliminate agencies, impound funds, et cetera, that's really not someplace the Supreme Court has gone. I should also note that in some ways, this is heading a completely different direction from where the Supreme Court conservative justices have been heading for a number of years. For a number of years, the Supreme Court has been trying to rein in federal agencies. And one of the primary ways that they've done this recently is they overturned the case that is referred to as Chevron. The Chevron case was a case that gave federal agencies very broad discretion to interpret vague or ambiguous statutory language in a way that would give them regulatory authority to go beyond things that might not have been obvious from the statutory language. And essentially, the Supreme Court recently struck that down and said, no, we are going to, the court is essentially going to have its own opinion on what statutory language means, how far it goes. We're not going to defer as much to the agency. And so in some ways, that counters executive power very, very significantly. This is one of the most significant administrative law cases in years. And the idea that the Supreme Court is suddenly going to turn on a dime, do a complete 180, head back in the other direction, and that they're going to do that for a lame duck president who's got about 3.5 years to go, just strikes me as unlikely. So I don't think people realize that the Supreme Court actually has some disincentives to sign off on everything that is President Trump is actually trying to argue in front of the courts.
Yeah, and I love this point, the first of just having executive power does not make the president king. And so kind of the stretches of executive power and understanding what that is and testing that is really important. And also the second point about I think is the more power the Supreme Court gives to the executive, the less power goes to the Supreme Court and to the judiciary, right? There's a little bit of a zero-sum game here between the three branches. And so directionally, the court hasn't been going in that direction to uphold the presidential executive power in the case of Chevron and otherwise. And so there is kind of this odds that they're at between the two branches. And in the conversations I've been having with friends, it's really like this moment of understanding whether the justices are committed to a judicial philosophy more than power, more than kind of anything else, more than the next 3.5 years, more than this term, more than maybe what benefits may accrue to them based on their decision making. And so it's really a moment to see what they're made of. Okay, and so the next question there is, I think now that you've mentioned that this isn't a constitutional crisis, and that even if there was one, it's not the end of democracy, it still feels like Trump is a threat to democracy. And so I'm curious your take on that.
So I think the first thing to remember is the Constitution, that our Constitution is the longest, it's the longest that any written constitution has been around. It has survived wars. It has survived Great Depressions. It has survived riots. It has survived pandemics. It has really been tested in many, many different ways previously, and we have made it through. One reason is that it's actually a fairly short, very flexible document, and also power is very decentralized. So even if there is distortions of power within the political context, is usually the case. The Constitution can accommodate that. So one thing to remember would be the 1960s. We had a radicalized war protest movement. We had riots. We had the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, a president, Robert F. Kennedy, a presidential candidate, Martin Luther King, a civil rights icon. And we also had government overreach. We had the FBI doing surveillance of U.S. citizens. We had a secret war in Cambodia. We had Watergate. So these were real challenges to our system. But during that time, we also we got a lot of things. We got voting rights legislation. We got Medicare. We got Medicaid. We addressed government abuses in foreign intelligence and in various other areas. And so this is one of those things. Sometimes a system not only has to be tested, but testing it makes it stronger. And I think a final thing to remember is that we are seeing democracies being subverted around the world. But one issue that is different in those countries than in ours is that in those countries, the Constitution is not that hard to change. Places like Hungary, Turkey, El Salvador, their legislations can change the Constitution much easier than we can in ours. You need to have 2/3 of the Congress and 3/5 of the states. our Constitution is much more decentralized, and there really are very few examples of countries like ours. And so it is really hard to take over our country. An example I'll give of something I think had people very upset was when President Trump was talking about a third term. And, obviously, if he got a constitutional amendment, he could do that, but that's not going to happen. Constitutional amendments are hard to get. His popularity is at historic lows for a president. And, good luck getting a constitutional amendment passed. If he just went ahead and ran, first of all, he'd have to get on the ballot in 50 states, which is, in and of itself might be a bit of a challenge since he's clearly violating the Constitution while doing it. Have to litigate all those cases. Then the Supreme Court would probably have to sign off on that. And I'm not really sure I'd see the incentive for the Supreme Court to commit political suicide in that manner. Then he'd have to win the election. He wouldn't have a stop the steal argument. In this case, he would have a I'm coming for the Constitution argument. And, I guess he won, a pretty good vote last time, but I'm not quite sure he'd have the same success this time. So what would be left? Well, I guess he could try a coup, but I'm not sure that I've seen his government able to hold any secret meetings for more than like 24 hours before it's leaked to the press. So I think he'd have a little bit of a hard time putting a coup together against 50 states and against a military that's been trained against military coups. So I understand that, we haven't generally been, threatened with this kind of thing before, but I also understand that I think we are not the kind of country that is easily taken over by one person.
Yeah, and I think that point that you're making about how the power in the U.S. Constitution's not only in the three branches of federal government that we talked about, but it's also distributed between the federal and state government. So this role that the 50 states have to play in maintaining the Constitution is very, very real. And to the points that you made about the good legislation that came out of the 60s, it was the power of the people and the pressure that really got those to be. And so there is a lot of inherent power in people and in the states and in the three branches of government that we all need to remember are levers against anything that may happen here. What about elections? I think we didn't kind of get to how elections play into the protection afforded to the Constitution as well.
I think that is really the most interesting part of our Constitution that people often do not talk about. So, of course, the courts are a big part of the enforcement of the Constitution, but actually the Constitution was inherently made to have the backstop of public voting to essentially run our government. And the idea is that you have your chance to course correct your politicians. In the House, you have it every 2 years. In the Senate, you have a staggered 6-year. The president, you have it 4 years. And so there is a certain amount of flexibility in the power of the government to do things, because the idea is that the elections would hold politicians to account. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we have midterm elections coming up in less than 2 years, and that these midterm elections are, in fact, probably going to be very significant. The British punters, as they're called, the British gamblers, have already said that they consider there to be an 80% chance that the House of Representatives will be Democratic next time around. The British punters are known for being pretty good predictors of presidential and congressional elections. And if the Democrats take over the House, then of course not only will the political agenda of the Trump administration pretty much be ended, but the news media and the political momentum will, of course, shift immediately to investigations, to oversight, potentially to impeachment. And it doesn't have to be impeachment of President Trump. That sometimes is a low-hanging fruit, but it can be impeachment of agency officials for actions that are considered to be extra-constitutional. And there are certainly, as we've said before, there are indications that there are agency see officials who are essentially defying court orders, and that would, under most scenarios, be impeachable events. So these upcoming midterms are very, very important. And I'd also like to point out there are real constitutional moments, political and constitutional moments in our country that have really fundamentally changed the nature of political coalitions. So one to look at is the contract with America, the '96 midterm elections, where the Republican Revolution really, to some extent, started. This is Newt Gingrich running a midterm election effort, and the document that was used was called a contract with America, and it was a series of legislative proposals signed by most Republican candidates trying to get into the House, and it was a series of proposals that essentially stated the agenda for the party to what they considered to be take back the government. So I think that whichever party, because you got to recognize that the Republican and Democratic parties have really been changing a lot of their positions lately. So whichever party coalesces around what is essentially what the American people are looking for is the one who is more likely to get momentum. So the next podcast series that we are planning on doing is actually going to start addressing these issues. We're going to address how the Constitution has changed and how the Constitution can be changed back or can be fixed. There are a lot of aspects of our constitutional system that are very unpopular, and that there are very strong poll numbers for changing that. And these are things that we would like to address in our next podcast. Just to run down those quickly, one of them is how our elections are done. This is obviously, as I was saying, one of the most important part of our Constitution is running our elections. Election, how you run elections is most often done at the state level, but there's a not often used power, which is the power of the federal government to regulate elections within some limited circumstances. And one of those would be to create a holiday for Election Day. This is something that is done in every country, almost every country around the world, either has their elections on holidays or on weekends. And this is something the United States could do. The polling on that is about 72%. Another one is protect abortion rights. About 63% of the American people support some protection or significant protection for abortion rights. This could be done by federal legislation, by Congress. Again, this is something that could be put in a legislative platform for a party that is trying to, again, create a popular appeal. Another one is to change the Senate filibuster. We're going to be talking about that. 60% of the American people would support changing the Senate filibuster. Another one is fixing the popular vote for president in the Electoral College. There's a popular vote interstate compact, which is an interesting idea. About 63% of Americans would like the popular vote for president to control. There are ways to limit corporate election spending. About 72% of Americans support that. Limiting gun rights, about 95% of Americans support that. Granting D.C. statehood, that's an interesting issue. That actually passed the House in 2021, so that came pretty close to being legislation. Increasing diversity in education, the Supreme Court recently struck that down. That could be something that could be fixed by legislation. About 64% of Americans support that. And a couple of other more interesting issues people don't know much about. Originalism, which we talked about in a previous podcast, which is a conservative argument for striking down a bunch of previous Supreme Court precedent that is considered to be liberal. Well, there's actually a lot of conservative cases that could be struck down if originalism was applied to them. So that's something that the liberal justices or the people who are academics could be interested in. And finally, there's a provision of the 14th Amendment to make sure that anybody who rebels against the United States government, who has taken an oath of office, such as somebody's been in the military, et cetera, can be kept out of the United States government. That's something that should have been done before January 6th, and certainly should be done after people in January 6th attacked our government and tried to essentially stage a small coup. Those people should be kept out of government. So this is 10 different proposals, mostly legislative proposals, that we'll be considering in our next podcast that are all ways that would essentially help to fix the Constitution.
I love that, Ken. And so really taking that point about how one of the ultimate constitutional backstops are elections, and they have consequences. And we have this opportunity with the next midterm elections to change the makeup of Congress. We should take with that the opportunity to reclaim the Constitution through these kind of 10 steps, these 10 opportunities to improve legislation and strengthen our rights. And if I go through them quickly, it sounds like first was election holiday, second was protecting reproductive rights, third was the filibuster, and changing that, the Electoral College, and changing how that is playing out in our elections, the corporate election spending, and addressing the free speech case of Citizens United versus FEC, limiting gun rights, granting DC statehood, supporting diversity in education, the kind of obscure point of false originalism and how to kind of stick with the parts of originalism that does make sense for us in this moment, and the last being keeping traitors out of the government. And so there is kind of a new contract with America that we should probably rename, but that we can make with the opportunity afforded to us. And to your point, our next series, we can dive into those 10 opportunities to reclaim the Constitution. So I think we covered a lot of ground here. I'm wondering if there's, we talked about kind of whether we're in a constitutional crisis right now, what that means, and kind of what we can expect with the Supreme Court, as well as what we can expect right now based on what we're seeing about the strength of democracy and a little bit of our role in determining how big of a threat the current actions are, as well as a proposal for how we can move forward in the years ahead. I'm wondering if there's anything you want to close this out with, anything we didn't cover.
No, I just want to say thanks to anybody who's been with us from the beginning and brought along and stayed with us through the end. This is, to me, the most important thing that the public needs to know right now is what is going on, what does it mean, and what can be done about it.
Thanks so much, Ken, and thanks for sharing your expertise and your thoughts with us over this ride. I know I've enjoyed it. I'm sure our listeners did too, so appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. And to everybody listening, thanks so much.